Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Theatre.com video, we're going to be further discussing the Xbox One's cloud computing capabilities. At last week's E3, there was a closed-door presentation, and it went by the name of Xbox 101, and it was led by Microsoft's engineer manager Jeff Henshaw, and he was discussing and pointing out what the potential is for cloud-based computing on Microsoft's Xbox One. Now remember, the PlayStation 4 out of the gate is more powerful than Xbox One, however Microsoft continue to assert that the 300,000 server cloud that they have access to, which of course is powered by Windows Azure, is going to nevertheless give their console the advantage over the PlayStation. Several developers, however, have actually said that it's not that great. Even, for example, the Witness creator said it was not more than a marketing trick. And there were multiple reasons behind this, primarily latency and internet connections. In other words, how fast your internet connection is, and also the time it takes for data to transfer backwards and forwards, in other words, latency. So that means that certain things cannot be done on the cloud. However, nevertheless, this demo, as I said, Xbox 101, or should I say this conference, was to point out that it actually can be really cool. So let's discuss it a little bit, shall we? Now, Turn 10 Studios have been discussing how Forza 5 will make use of the cloud, and the idea is to improve the AI and basically make it more human-like. So, how did the cloud begin in terms of the demonstration? Well, it started out by Microsoft gathering huge amounts of data from NASA, and basically it was showing various celestial bodies and solar systems and so forth, as well as about 30,000 light years beyond it. Then an Xbox One engineer took to rendering the asteroid belt which lies between Mars and Jupiter. Now that has about 40,000 asteroids within it. They then used the Xbox One's processing power to animate as well as calculate these various trajectories of the asteroids in real time. Henshaw then was insisting that the Xbox One is 10 times more powerful than the Xbox 360. You may remember from previous videos as well as interviews that this has been called into question numerous times. Nevertheless, in a quote, he said, "We've crammed the horsepower of over 10 Xbox 360s into one elegant design that lets us computationally insanely complex operations." So, what does that mean for the cloud-based technology? Well, as I said, the Xbox One is capable of doing 40,000 asteroids at a time. However, then the cloud comes in, and it was managing to perform 330,000 asteroids all at the same time. This means that they are being computed and rendered in real time, which means that you're getting about 400,000 updates per second. So how exactly does an asteroid belt translate to games? That's a very good question, my friend. However, he says that they're actually quite a good comparison. As they were moving through the asteroid belts, asteroids that were further away, in other words, further away objects, were able to skip a little bit, and that's fine, as it doesn't really need to be so smooth as asteroids that are, say, close up. However, the closest things are those are actually offloaded to the cloud. The purpose behind this is to keep them moving smoothly and actually calculating the trajectory correctly. So, what does that mean for games? Well, that means that you'll be able to use all of the local processing power, of course, on the Xbox One, just as you can on traditional PCs or even the Xbox 360 and so forth, and that will make sure that the system works snappily and so forth, which of course is one of the major issues with cloud-based gaming traditionally. However, other things that aren't reactive, and this would include stuff like foliage, enemy AI, so forth and so forth, that will actually be offloaded to the cloud. He also pointed out one of the things that I've been talking about for a while now in terms of a possibility, that the cloud never stops. In other words, even if one of the server breaks, your game world will continue because you'll have multiple backups. What the hell is the purpose of this? Well, imagine you're in a world like Skyrim. Now, one of the problems with Skyrim is obviously the world doesn't continue to function if you are offline. If your Xbox or your PC, whatever, is switched off, that's it. That's all she wrote. However, for the cloud, that is not the case. Therefore, if you were to create a building or whatever, wear and tear for the weather will continue to persist. So in other words, if you haven't played for a long time, in theory at least, the weather will still change. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard of Titanfall, which of course is both an Xbox One, Xbox 360 and a PC. And it's going to be seeing various scenarios with AI combatants and so forth, all happening in multiplayer, as well as single player. Now, one of the leads on the title actually was speaking in an interview, and he said, Phase 1 is you have a single player world that exists in multiplayer, so you have a lot of AI in the cloud is really helping us with. We're calculating a lot of AI in the end, and we have our own dedicated servers. That's a lot of tough stuff with your NAT settings. We don't have to worry about any of that anymore, so partying up is a breeze. Your NAT can be restricted if you want. The cloud, I don't know if we would have attempted something like this if we'd not have access to it. In some ways, we're trying something different, but it can also be inspiring to the crew to see there's something here that's really powerful we can use. What could we do that's different with it, and how can we push it? We're just starting to scratch the surface of it. We're not even stressing it out yet, but the cloud gives us that. We started down a path with it and it supports what we're ultimately after, which is a multiplayer campaign that's combining these worlds together with dedicated servers. He was also talking about AI and physics. He said, it's not just peer-to-peer anymore. We have just wiped that away. In the past, when you were playing multiplayer games, you had to make sure that the party leader had an open NAT. It was just a big hassle. We don't have to worry about any of that anymore. It's fantastic. When I say the cloud, I talk about dedicated servers as well and how they interact with each other. We're really happy with it. The developers of Watch Dogs has also spoken about this, also pointing out that it's very similar to multiplayer games that there's latency. So in other words, they're pointing out just how well it can be used for AI. However, that is certainly not the end of it. For example, the way a tree reacts to weather, it's physics, right? It's bending materials well. What if I could run that on the cloud? It doesn't need to be fully synced. There are occasions where that could be an advantage, but it's clear that short term there's plenty of power within the machines, and that's where our engineers are working. Meanwhile, the executive producer of Battlefield, Patrick Back, has also been speaking on this. In practice, we're doing things in real time, so you don't want to send an explosion to the cloud, calculate it, then send the data back down, and if it goes perf, we have done stuff in real time, but I can see other things that could potentially do with it. For example, AI. However, he still states that he believes that AI is gimmicky on the cloud because it needs to be calculated in real time. And he says, it doesn't matter if you send it to the cloud and it only takes a second, it's still a second too late. I want it for the next frame. But real time and cloud to me sound right now very tricky. I haven't seen an actual application for it. I'm not sure how the cloud would work for real time stuff. But I can see how it could work for non-real-time stuff where you need a lot of calculations. Meanwhile, as I said earlier, the Witness developer Jonathan Blow has already basically been trouncing on the cloud idea. And he said, I can spin up 10,000 virtual servers per host. That would all suck. Saying 300,000 when they're all virtual is a lie. And indeed, during the end of the presentation, Henshaw himself was asked if the 300,000 servers available to the Xbox One were actually physical or virtual, or a combination of both. He said, we haven't gone into that level of detail yet. So, what exactly is a virtual machine? A virtual machine is basically an operating system within an operating system that shares physical hardware resources. If you guys look above you or below you or to the left or right or wherever the hell your PC is right now, assuming you're of course watching this on a computer, you'll see a dedicated system. In other words, those resources are your own. A server is pretty much exactly the same thing as a PC, of course. The differences are maybe a different model of CPU, for example, Xenon. Larger amounts of RAM. And RAID hard disks and so forth, as well as redundancy and backups and a few other bits and pieces. But for all intents and purposes, it's a computer. So what exactly is a virtual system? Well, as I just mentioned, it is a series of operating systems that are running within a main core OS. You guys can get an idea of this by using something like VirtualBox. So for example, you could be running Windows Server 2012 within a Windows Server 2012 box. Or you can have, say, Linux within a Windows Server environment, or you can have Linux within Linux, or you can have Linux within server, or you can have server within Linux. You guys get the idea. You can have pretty much any combination of things. So when he's saying that these are, well, virtual machines, it's kind of not really good because, as you said, as Jonathan said, once again, there's no real point to saying something, because what I could make, for example, I could make a virtual machine out of my own system, and I could allocate that virtual machine a very small amount of CPU computing power. I could allocate it a very small amount of RAM, and that's a virtual machine, and I could make 20 or 30 or 40 of them or whatever, but that doesn't really do you any good. I mean, what are you going to do on it? Play Minecraft or say Minesweeper? Right, so my point being that, once again, Microsoft are being a bit sketchy on the details, and this is stuff that I don't really like. However, Henshaw was continuing. He said the game developers are some of the most creative people on the planet, and they know to create worlds of requirements to light up some of those brilliant imaginative experiences. So there are a number of different issues right now. For example, let's say you are a game developer, right? You create a game that either uses exclusively the cloud, so in other words, it needs to run, or you develop a game that is better with the cloud. Okay? Internet connections are not seamless. They do drop out. Okay, so Microsoft give a 24-hour activation, which most people say is crap to begin with. But what happens if your internet just falls over for like 10 minutes? And it happens a lot. Even my internet connection goes out, and I live in a city. It just happens. 10 minutes later, it's back up, right? It's not often it happens, but, it does happen. What goes on then? What about if, like, for example, you need to reboot the router? Your brother's rebooting the router for X reason. What if there's, some unforeseen event? What happens to your game? It's single player, right? So, okay, I know I'll get tossed off if I'm a multiplayer, ha ha ha. But let's say we're playing single player. What happens then? Does it suddenly dumb down? In other words, do the graphics become a little bit worse? Does it simply pause for a moment, or what? That's the problem. Once again, we have the same issues. Because we know right now that latency is going to be an issue. So this is pretty much what I've been saying in another of today's videos. Microsoft are being really casual on the details. They're saying that is a huge benefit. But here's the thing. Unless I know how it's going to benefit me, they're pointing out all this AI stuff. But the problem is, if something reacts 1 second later after I shoot it, potentially if you've got a crappy internet connection, that's not really a smooth single-player game anymore, is it? And we know it can't really react that well with physics that are interacting immediately. So once again, this is just a problem. I'm not saying that I'm not convinced of the cloud. I'm not saying that it's terrible technology. I'm not saying that it sucks. I'm just saying that it really... I want to see it in action. And I want to see it in action not just under perfect circumstances either. As I've said a couple of times, I have a 120 MB connection. That's great for me, whoop-de-doo, but what about if you're just skirting under the requirement, or just have the requirements for the minimum amount of internet that I think the Xbox One supports, which I believe is 1.5 Mbps? What about if you've just got that? What about if you've got 2? Then what? What about if you've got 3 megabyte connection and you're trying to play a multiplayer game and it's also trying to download all these physics as well? Does that mean that my experience is going to be worse than yours? Let's say I've got a 2 megabyte connection, a 3 megabyte connection, and yours has a fantastic, and you have like a 50. Does that mean that my experience is going to be inferior? Does that mean that somehow or another everyone's going to be getting slightly different experiences based upon internet connections? Does that mean that now we're going to see certain games that have internet connection requirements on them? Just how PCs now have you must have 4 gigabytes of RAM and X amount of CPU power and X amount of GPU power? Or does that not really matter? Is it just going to be better at rendering weather effects and stuff like that? These are all questions I really wish Microsoft could answer, and it's clear that they haven't either figured out all the answers yet, or they don't really know how to answer the questions, or they don't know that we won't like the answers. Obviously, some people are even being cynical. They're just saying, well, this is just a way to sweeten the idea for the system always being online. I don't know if I'm going to be that cynical because, well, it's very easy to be really, really cynical, and it just doesn't really amount to much, right? Because it doesn't really achieve anything. So let's just assume that they're just doing it because they really believe the future. I would still much prefer more GPU power on board. But we'll see. Now, obviously, guys, this is the second video that I've done on this, and I know I've skirted over some stuff like latency and so forth. So if you guys are unfamiliar with that, I would recommend you check out the previous video. Because I go heavily into how latency will affect the cloud and so on, and it just is better than me re-repeating everything for the sake of this video. It's just pointless because I've gone into it in painstaking detail in the previous video, so I'd recommend you check that out. Anyway, that just about does it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.